What would you do if you woke up one morning and discovered that the largest battleship ever constructed in human history was pointing its massive guns directly at your ship? Guns so enormous they could throw shells the weight of a small automobile more than 25 miles across the open ocean. What would you do if your entire vessel, every piece of steel, every sailor, every weapon system combined, weighed less than a single gun turret on the enemy warship hunting you down? What would you do if running away meant certain death for thousands of American sailors on the defenseless aircraft carriers behind you?
Here are the
Men who
10
were
video
counting on you to
prompts for
protect them,
VEO3
even though
with
protection
no
seemed
titles,
utterly
just the
impossible.
scene or sequence
Commander
description.
Ernest Edwin Evans knew exactly what he would do in that situation. He would attack. This is the story of USS Johnston DD-557, a Fletcher-class destroyer that should have been nothing more than a minor footnote in the vast history of naval warfare. Instead, she became one of the greatest legends the United States Navy has ever produced. This is the story of how one relatively small warship, armed with 5-inch guns that could barely scratch the paint on a Japanese battleship, charged directly at the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. This is the story of 2 smoke screens laid under impossible conditions, 1 massive bluff executed with audacity that bordered on insanity, and the kind of raw human courage that seems impossible until you realize that ordinary men are capable of truly extraordinary things when everything they love hangs in the balance. On the morning of October 25, 1944, in the waters off Samar Island in the Philippines, USS Johnston and her crew of 327 American sailors would face the 18-inch guns of Yamato, the mightiest battleship the world had ever seen or would ever see again. They had absolutely no business surviving even 5 minutes of that encounter. The mathematics of naval warfare said they should die quickly and accomplish nothing. But Ernest Evans had made a solemn promise to his crew on the day their ship was commissioned, and he intended to keep that promise no matter what the cost. Johnston would never run from a fight. She would attack, and keep attacking until she could attack no more. The remarkable story of Johnston's impossible last stand begins with the extraordinary man who commanded her. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was not the typical United States Navy officer of his era. Born on August 13, 1908, in Pawnee, Oklahoma, Evans was a proud member of both the Cherokee and Creek nations, making him one of the very few Native American officers serving in the United States Navy during World War II. He had graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1931, standing in the middle of his class academically, but already showing the aggressive fighting spirit that would define his career. Evans had spent the years between the wars learning his trade, serving on various vessels, and steadily climbing the ranks of the Naval Officer Corps. By the time war came to America at Pearl Harbor, Evans was an experienced and capable officer who had already demonstrated an unusual willingness to take risks and push his ships to their limits. He was exactly the kind of commander the Navy needed for the desperate fighting that lay ahead. In October 1943, Evans was given command of the newly constructed USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer fresh from the shipyards at Seattle. The Fletcher class represented the finest destroyer design the United States had ever produced, a well-balanced combination of speed, firepower, and seaworthiness that made them ideal for the varied demands of Pacific warfare. Evans was proud of his new command and determined to make her the finest fighting ship in the fleet. When Johnston was officially commissioned on October 27, 1943, Evans gathered his crew on the deck and delivered a speech that would prove prophetic beyond anything anyone present could have imagined. He looked at the young faces before him, many of them teenagers who had never been to sea before, and told them exactly what kind of ship they were joining and what kind of captain they would be serving under. He told them that this was going to be a fighting ship, that he intended to go in harm's way, and that anyone who did not want to go along with that program should step forward and get off right then, because there would be no room for hesitation once they put to sea. Not a single man stepped forward. Not one sailor requested a transfer. The crew of Johnston had chosen to follow Ernest Evans into whatever battles lay ahead, and they would follow him all the way to glory and death on that October morning off Samar. Evans was a warrior in the truest and most ancient sense of that word. He believed in aggressive action at all times, in taking the fight to the enemy before the enemy could bring the fight to him, in never giving an inch of ocean without making the other side pay dearly for it. He drilled his crew relentlessly, pushing them to master every aspect of their duties, until they could perform their jobs in complete darkness, in the chaos of battle, in any conditions the Pacific Ocean could throw at them. The results of this intensive training became apparent during Johnston's first year of operations. The destroyer participated in numerous combat actions across the Pacific, earning a reputation as one of the most aggressive and effective ships in the fleet. Evans pushed his vessel into situations that more cautious commanders would have avoided, always seeking contact with the enemy, always looking for opportunities to strike. By October 1944, Johnston and her crew were hardened veterans who had complete confidence in their ship and their commander. They had faced Japanese aircraft, submarines, and shore batteries. They had provided fire support for amphibious landings and escorted convoys through dangerous waters. They believed they could handle anything the enemy could throw at them. They were about to be tested beyond anything they could have imagined. Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, the workhorse of the American destroyer force during World War II. The United States built 175 of these vessels during the war, and they served in every theater of operations from the Atlantic to the Pacific. At 76 feet long and displacing about 2,500 tons when fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, Johnston was fast, maneuverable, and well armed for a ship of her size. Her main battery consisted of 5 5-inch guns mounted in single turrets, 2 forward and 3 aft. These weapons could fire approximately 15 rounds per minute per gun, hurling 55-pound shells at targets up to 9 miles away. Against enemy aircraft, against other destroyers, against smaller vessels and shore installations, these guns were formidable weapons. Against the armored hulls of battleships and heavy cruisers, they were almost completely ineffective. Johnston also carried 10 torpedo tubes arranged in 2 quintuple mounts amidships. These tubes launched the Mark 15 torpedo, a weapon with an 8 or 25-pound warhead capable of sinking or crippling any ship in the world if it struck in the right place. The torpedoes were Johnston's only real hope of hurting the heavy ships she would face off Samar, and Evans knew he would need to use them perfectly if his ship was to accomplish anything meaningful. Additional armament included various anti-aircraft weapons and depth charges for anti-submarine warfare. Johnston could make over 35 knots at flank speed, fast enough to outrun most warships of the era, though not fast enough to escape from determined pursuit by Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships. Against another destroyer, Johnston would have been a formidable and dangerous opponent. Against light cruisers, she could hold her own if handled skillfully and aggressively. Against heavy cruisers, she was at a significant disadvantage, but could still fight effectively if she could get her torpedoes into the water. Against battleships, she was a minnow facing sharks, a rabbit charging at wolves, a sacrifice waiting to happen. But Ernest Evans did not think in terms of what his ship could not do. He thought only in terms of what she must do. And on the morning of October 25, 1944, what she must do was attack the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. The Japanese center force that emerged from San Bernardino Strait in the pre-dawn darkness of October 25, 1944, represented the greatest concentration of naval firepower the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever committed to a single operation. This armada was the centerpiece of Operation Show Go, Japan's desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion force at Lake Gulf and reverse the tide of the Pacific War. At the heart of this mighty fleet steamed the battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever constructed by any nation. Yamato displaced over 72,000 tons at full load, more than 3 times the displacement of the largest American battleships, and nearly 30 times the displacement of Johnston. Her main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on any warship before or since. Each of Yamato's main guns could throw a shell weighing approximately 200 pounds, more than 1.5 tons of steel and explosive, over 25 miles with reasonable accuracy. The explosive power of a single one of these shells was sufficient to destroy a destroyer completely, leaving nothing but scattered debris and a spreading oil slick on the surface of the ocean. Yamato carried over 1,000 of these monstrous projectiles in her magazines, enough to obliterate every ship in Taffy 3 many times over. But Yamato was not alone. Alongside the super-battleship sailed her equally formidable consorts, the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, each of them individually capable of destroying the entire American escort force. Nagato carried 8 16-inch guns, while Kongo and Haruna mounted 8 14-inch guns apiece. Any one of these vessels could have annihilated Johnston with a single well-aimed salvo. 6 heavy cruisers accompanied the battleships, including Kumano Suzuya, Chikuma, Chokai Haguro, and Tone. These vessels displaced around 15,000 tons each and carried 8-inch guns capable of destroying destroyers at ranges exceeding 10 miles. 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers completed the Japanese force, providing screening and additional firepower. The combined weight of metal this fleet could throw in a single broadside was almost beyond calculation. If every gun in the Japanese center force fired simultaneously, the shells would weigh more than some small warships displaced. Against this overwhelming firepower, Taffy 3 had exactly 1 5-inch gun on each of its 6 escort carriers, plus the guns of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The American force was never designed for surface combat. The escort carriers were converted merchant ship and tanker hulls, slow vessels with thin unarmored sides that could be penetrated by machine gun fire. They were intended to provide close air support for troops, ashore and anti-submarine patrol over the invasion fleet. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were supposed to protect these vulnerable carriers from submarine attack and provide anti-aircraft defense. No one had ever imagined that they would face enemy battleships. When the lookouts on the American ships first spotted the Japanese force in the gray light of early morning, many officers simply refused to believe what their eyes were telling them. The distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships were unmistakable to anyone who had studied ship recognition, but this had to be some kind of mistake. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet was supposed to be guarding San Bernardino Strait with the most powerful American battleships and carriers. The Japanese center force could not possibly be steaming unopposed toward the vulnerable escort carriers. But Halsey was not guarding San Bernardino Strait. In one of the most controversial decisions of the Pacific War, he had taken his entire fleet north to chase a Japanese carrier force that turned out to be little more than a decoy, empty flight decks with barely enough aircraft to make them look threatening. The Japanese Operation Go was working exactly as planned. While Halsey chased shadows to the north, the real threat was emerging from San Bernardino Strait with nothing between it and the American invasion fleet. The questions of why this happened, who was responsible, and what should have been done differently would be debated for decades after the war. But none of those questions mattered to Ernest Evans as he watched the Japanese fleet emerge from the morning haze. What mattered was that enemy battleships were approaching the carriers he had sworn to protect. What mattered was that thousands of American lives depended on what happened in the next few hours. What mattered was that someone had to buy time for the carriers to escape, and Johnston was in position to do something about it. Evans did not wait for orders from Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, the commander of Taffy 3. He did not convene a conference with his officers to discuss options. He did not hesitate for even a moment to calculate the odds or consider the chances of survival. The moment he confirmed the identity of the approaching enemy fleet through his binoculars, he ordered Johnston to flank speed and turned his ship directly toward the Japanese. The bridge crew watched in something approaching disbelief as their captain ordered them to close with an enemy fleet that outweighed their entire task force by a factor of perhaps 50 to 1. The fire control officer began tracking targets, hardly believing that they were actually going to attack battleships with 5-inch guns. The torpedo officer prepared his weapons, understanding that the 10 fish in Johnston's tubes represented their only real chance of hurting the enemy heavy ships. At Zoo 700, while the other American ships were still trying to understand what was happening and the escort carriers were beginning their desperate flight to the east, Johnston opened fire on the lead Japanese heavy cruiser at a range of over 18,000 yards. The 5-inch shells were unlikely to do significant damage at that extreme range, but Evans wanted the enemy to know that someone was fighting back. He wanted to draw Japanese attention toward his charging destroyer and away from the fleeing carriers. The Japanese responded to Johnston's challenge with deadly enthusiasm. Shells from multiple Japanese ships began splashing around the lone American destroyer, the colored dye markers that the Japanese used to spot the fall of their shells turning the ocean into a deadly rainbow of destruction. Red geysers from one ship, blue from another, yellow and green from still others, each splash representing a shell that could obliterate Johnston with a single direct hit. Evans pressed on through this storm of steel. Johnston raced toward the enemy at over 30 knots, her guns firing continuously at targets she could barely hurt, her crew working with the desperate efficiency of men who understood they were living on borrowed time. Every second they survived was another second for the carriers to run. Every shell the Japanese fired at Johnston was a shell not fired at the vulnerable flat tops. As 0715, with Japanese shells still splashing around his ship, Evans ordered the smoke generators activated. Thick, black chemical smoke began pouring from Johnston's stern, creating an artificial fog bank that spread across the water behind the charging destroyer. This smoke screen would help conceal the fleeing escort carriers from Japanese gunners, making accurate fire control almost impossible through the chemical haze. This was the first of the 2 smoke screens that would define Johnston's battle, a wall of artificial concealment that gave the escort carriers their only real hope of escape. But laying smoke while running away was not Ernest Evans' style. He was laying smoke while attacking, using the artificial fog to cover his own approach to torpedo range while simultaneously protecting the ships behind him. The heavy cruiser Kumano became Johnston's primary target as Evans drove his ship toward the enemy formation. At 10,000 yards, the Japanese cruiser was well within range of Johnston's torpedoes, and Evans intended to use every single one of them. He ordered the ship to close to optimal firing range, driving through the barrage of enemy fire with what one survivor would later describe as reckless and magnificent abandon. The approach to torpedo range seemed to take forever and no time at all. Shells continued to splash around Johnston, each one potentially fatal, each one miraculously missing as Evans maneuvered his ship through the pattern of enemy fire. The gun crews continued to pump 5-inch shells at the Japanese, scoring occasional hits that did little damage, but kept the enemy gunners focused on Johnston rather than the fleeing carriers. At 07:20, having survived the gauntlet of enemy fire, Johnston reached optimal torpedo range and launched all 10 of her Mark 15 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. The torpedoes streaked through the water at 45 knots, their wakes visible against the dark surface of the ocean as they raced toward the Japanese warship. Evans immediately ordered hard right rudder, turning Johnston away from the enemy to open the range and assess the results of his attack. The American sailors watched anxiously as the torpedo wakes converged on Kumano. The wait for impact seemed endless, each second stretching into eternity as the weapons closed the final distance to their target. Then, finally, the explosion. At least one torpedo found its mark, possibly more. Kumano staggered visibly as the massive detonation tore off her entire bow section, flooding her forward compartments and bringing the heavy cruiser to a shuddering halt. The first blood of the surface engagement had been drawn by the smallest and most vulnerable American combatant, and she had crippled a heavy cruiser that outweighed her by a factor of 6. The men of Johnston had achieved something remarkable in those first desperate minutes of battle. A single destroyer had charged the most powerful surface fleet in the world and had scored a significant hit, putting a major enemy warship out of action. It was a victory beyond any reasonable expectation, a triumph of courage and skill over overwhelming odds. But Johnston's success came at a terrible and immediate price. Even as her torpedoes were striking Kumano and ripping the bow off the Japanese cruiser, Japanese gunfire was finding Johnston. At 07:30, while Johnston was still turning away from her torpedo attack, the battleship Congo scored 3 direct hits with her 14-inch main battery guns. Each shell weighed over 400 pounds and traveled at velocities exceeding 500 feet per second. The impacts on the small destroyer were absolutely catastrophic. One shell struck the after engine room, destroying the massive machinery that powered half of Johnston's propulsion system. The blast killed or wounded everyone in the compartment and started fires that would burn for the rest of the battle. Johnston's speed was instantly cut in half, from over 30 knots to barely 15. Another shell hit the after gun mounts, destroying 3 of Johnston's 55-inch guns in a single devastating impact. The explosion killed the gun crews instantly and turned the after section of the destroyer into a twisted mass of wreckage. Johnston had lost more than half of her main battery in a matter of seconds. The third shell caused additional damage throughout the after section of the ship, rupturing fuel lines, destroying equipment, and adding to the spreading fires. The combined effect of these 3 hits transformed Johnston from a swift and deadly attacker into a crippled vessel struggling simply to stay afloat. Simultaneously with the battleship hits, shells from a Japanese light cruiser added to Johnston's agony. 6-inch rounds tore through her thin superstructure, starting additional fires and causing casualties throughout the ship. The radar antenna was shot away, blinding Johnston to threats beyond visual range. The radio transmitters were damaged, limiting communications with other American ships. The damage would have been more than enough to knock most ships out of the fight entirely. Johnston was reduced to half speed at best. She had lost more than half of her main battery. Her fire control systems were damaged. Her radar was destroyed. Many of her crew were already dead or wounded, with more casualties occurring every minute as fires spread and secondary explosions racked the damaged vessel. On the bridge, Commander Ernest Evans was among the wounded. Shell fragments from one of the explosions had torn through his body, inflicting wounds that would have incapacitated most men. 2 fingers from his left hand had been blown away by the blast, and blood soaked through his uniform to pool on the deck plates beneath him. A corpsman rushed to the bridge to treat the captain's wounds, but Evans waved him away impatiently. There were other men more seriously hurt who needed attention first. Evans wrapped his mutilated hand in a rough bandage and continued to command his ship. Johnston might be crippled, but as long as Ernest Evans was alive and conscious, she would continue to fight. Evans ordered damage control parties to work on containing the fires and flooding that threatened to destroy the ship from within. He ordered the 2 remaining forward guns to continue firing at any Japanese ship within range. He ordered the engineers to squeeze every possible knot of speed out of the damaged propulsion system. Johnston was hurt, badly hurt, but she was not finished yet. For the next several minutes, Johnston staggered through the swirling chaos of battle, her remaining guns engaging targets of opportunity, while her crew fought desperately to save their ship. The larger battle had devolved into complete confusion, with American destroyers making their own attacks on the Japanese fleet, aircraft from the escort carriers diving on enemy ships, and smoke from various sources obscuring visibility across the entire combat area. It was during this period of chaos that Ernest Evans made the decision that would cement his status as one of the greatest naval heroes in American history. Despite his wounds, despite the crippling damage to his ship, despite the overwhelming enemy force that surrounded them, he ordered Johnston back into the attack. At approximately 0730, while Johnston was still reeling from the hits she had taken, the destroyers Hull and Heermann began their own torpedo attacks on the Japanese fleet. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was also moving to attack, her crew preparing to launch their own weapons at the enemy heavy ships. These small vessels were in even more desperate situations than Johnston, racing toward the enemy with no realistic hope of survival. Evans saw his fellow destroyers going in and knew immediately that he had to help them. Johnston could no longer make torpedo attacks of her own because her tubes were empty and there was no way to reload while under fire. But she still had 2 working 5-inch guns in her forward mounts. She could still make smoke to conceal the other attacking ships. And, most importantly, she could still draw enemy fire away from the other American vessels by presenting herself as a target. What happened next would become one of the most celebrated episodes of courage in the entire Pacific War. Johnston, damaged burning, barely able to make 15 knots, turned once again toward the enemy and charged directly at the Japanese destroyer squadron that was forming up to attack the fleeing American escort carriers. The Japanese destroyers had been ordered to pursue and destroy the vulnerable carriers. If they could get within torpedo range of those thin, skinned vessels, the slaughter would be complete. Every one of the 6 escort carriers could be sunk, along with thousands of American sailors and airmen. The Japanese destroyers were racing to accomplish this mission when Johnston appeared in their path. Evans opened fire at close range, Johnston's 2 remaining guns pumping shells into the lead Japanese destroyers as fast as the crews could load and fire. The Japanese formation began to scatter, individual ships maneuvering to avoid the seemingly insane American vessel that was boring in despite her obvious and catastrophic damage. This was the Bluff, the second element of Johnston's legendary battle alongside the smoke screens. Evans was making the Japanese believe that his crippled destroyer was still a serious threat, that she was still capable of launching torpedoes, that she was perhaps the spearhead of a larger American counterattack, that the Japanese could not yet see through the smoke and confusion. The bluff worked brilliantly. The Japanese destroyer captains could not understand what they were seeing. This American ship was clearly on her last legs, trailing smoke and flame, listing from damage, obviously dying. Yet she was attacking them with all the aggression of a fresh and fully capable warship. What did the Americans know that the Japanese did not? Were there more American ships behind this crazed attacker? Was this the leading edge of a counterattack by fresh forces? The confusion Evans created caused the Japanese destroyer attack to stall. Precious minutes were bought for the escort carriers to continue their flight toward the east, and toward the rain squalls that might conceal them. The smoke screens that Johnston and other American ships had laid continued to drift across the battle area, hiding the vulnerable carriers from accurate Japanese gunfire. For nearly 30 minutes, Johnston fought essentially alone against the Japanese destroyer squadron. Her 2 remaining forward guns fired until their barrels glowed visibly red from the heat of continuous firing. Her crew passed ammunition by hand up to the gun mounts when the mechanical hoists failed. Her damage control parties continued fighting fires and flooding with whatever equipment still functioned. Commander Evans remained in command throughout this period, despite his wounds, despite the blood loss, despite the chaos that surrounded him on every side. When the bridge became untenable due to damage and smoke, he moved to the fantail and continued directing the ship's movements by shouting orders down to the men at the helm. His voice was hoarse, his body weakening from loss of blood, but his will remained absolutely unbroken. The Japanese eventually began to realize that Johnston was not the threat she appeared to be. Her torpedo tubes were empty and could not be reloaded. Her gunfire, while accurate and determined, was not actually sinking their ships. She was a magnificent nuisance, a heroic irritation, but she could not actually stop them if they chose to press their attack. But by the time the Japanese understood the truth about Johnston, the opportunity to destroy the escort carriers had largely passed. The American flat-tops had used the time purchased by Evans and his crew to open the range, to find concealment in rain squalls, to launch additional aircraft that were now attacking the Japanese fleet from all directions. The bluff had served its purpose. The Japanese began to close in on Johnston for the kill. At approximately 09:45, Japanese destroyers surrounded the crippled American vessel and began firing at point-blank range. Shell after shell slammed into the dying ship. Fires raged uncontrollably throughout her hull. The list increased steadily as flooding spread from one compartment to another. Johnston's remaining guns continued firing until they were physically destroyed by enemy hits. Men continued to man their stations until those stations ceased to exist. The American flag continued to fly from the mainmast despite the inferno consuming the ship beneath it. Evans gave his final order at some point during this terminal phase of the battle. The word went out for all hands to abandon ship. Those who could still move began going over the side, lowering themselves or jumping into the oil, covered water as Japanese shells continued to impact around them. Many of the crew were too badly wounded to abandon ship on their own. Their shipmates dragged them to the rails and helped them into the water, staying with wounded men even when doing so meant risking their own lives. The brotherhood of Johnston's crew remained intact even in these final desperate moments. Johnston began her final roll at approximately 10:10, less than 3 hours after she had first charged the Japanese fleet. Survivors in the water watched as their ship turned over, as the battle ensign that had flown throughout the engagement disappeared beneath the waves, as the vessel they had called home slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was never seen again after ordering his crew to abandon ship. Whether he went down with Johnston or died in the water from his wounds, no one will ever know. His body was never recovered from the waters off Samar. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American naval officer in history to receive that highest of military decorations. Of Johnston's crew of 327 men, only 141 survived the battle and the terrible ordeal that followed. The survivors spent nearly 3 days floating in the open ocean before being rescued, enduring shark attacks, exposure to the tropical sun, and the trauma of watching their shipmates die around them one by one. When they were finally picked up by American vessels, they told stories of their captain and their ship that seemed almost too incredible to believe. But the stories were absolutely true. Ernest Evans had done exactly what he promised on the day Johnston was commissioned. He had taken his ship in harm's way. He had never run from a fight. He had attacked the most powerful enemy fleet in the Pacific and had made them pay for their advance. He had continued fighting until his ship could fight no more. The impact of Johnston's sacrifice extended far beyond her own crew. Her aggressive attacks, combined with those of the other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3, had thrown the Japanese fleet into complete confusion. The smoke screens she and other ships laid had concealed the escort carriers long enough for them to escape. Her bluff against the Japanese destroyers had prevented a coordinated attack that might have destroyed all 6 of the fleeing carriers. Most importantly, Johnston's courage had helped convince Admiral Kurita that he was facing a much stronger American force than actually existed. The aggressive, seemingly suicidal attacks by the American destroyers suggested a confidence that completely belied the desperate reality of Taffy 3's situation. When Kurita finally ordered his fleet to withdraw at 09:11, he believed he was breaking off contact with a major American naval force, not 6 escort carriers and their handful of escorts. The 2 smoke screens that Johnston laid during the battle served both practical and psychological purposes. On the practical side, the chemical smoke concealed the American carriers from Japanese gunfire, making accurate fire control almost impossible through the artificial haze. The Japanese were forced to fire blindly at targets they could barely see, wasting ammunition and scoring far fewer hits than they should have given their overwhelming firepower advantage. On the psychological side, the smoke screens suggested planned and professional defensive operations being executed by a force that knew exactly what it was doing. Rather than the panicked flight of a surprised and helpless task force, the Americans appeared to be executing a coordinated defensive plan complete with proper screening tactics. This impression contributed to Japanese uncertainty about exactly what they were facing. The bluff was even more significant than the smoke screens. By attacking continuously, by never showing the slightest hint of fear or hesitation, by pressing forward despite catastrophic damage that should have forced any sensible commander to withdraw, Johnston made the Japanese believe that the American force was far more formidable than it actually was. A fleet that could launch such aggressive counterattacks must surely have reserves of strength that were not immediately visible through the smoke and confusion. The crippled destroyer charging the Japanese line might be the leading element of a much larger force about to emerge from the haze. The continuous air attacks raining down on the Japanese ships might be coming from fleet carriers rather than the insignificant escort carriers the Japanese thought they were chasing. This uncertainty ate away at Admiral Kurita's confidence throughout the battle. He had already been through a harrowing experience the previous day when his fleet had been savaged by American air attacks in the Sibian Sea, and his flagship had been torpedoed from under him. He was physically exhausted and mentally stressed. The aggressive American resistance he encountered off Samar pushed him toward the breaking point. Evans understood all of this instinctively, even if he could not have articulated it in strategic terms. He knew that his ship could not actually defeat the Japanese fleet. He knew that Johnston would almost certainly be sunk, and that he himself would probably die along with many of his crew. But he also knew that by fighting aggressively, by never giving the enemy a moment of peace to think clearly, he could create doubt and confusion that might save the carriers. It was a desperate gamble, the longest of long shots. But it was the only gamble that made any sense given the circumstances. Running away would have meant certain death for the carriers and their crews. Surrendering was unthinkable for a man like Ernest Evans. Fighting offered at least a chance, however vanishingly small, that the carriers might survive and that the sacrifice of Johnston and her crew would mean something. Evans chose to fight. He chose to attack. And in doing so, he helped save the invasion of the Philippines and possibly shortened the Pacific War by weeks or months. Japanese officers who witnessed Johnston's final battle spoke of her with respect that bordered on genuine awe. They could not understand why a clearly doomed ship would continue to attack when retreat might have saved at least some of her crew. They could not comprehend the mentality of a commander who would charge battleships with a destroyer, who would contest against cruisers with 5-inch guns, who would bluff an entire squadron with an empty torpedo battery. But they recognized courage when they saw it. One Japanese officer reportedly saluted as Johnston rolled over and sank, acknowledging the extraordinary bravery of her captain and crew. Whether this specific story is literally true or has grown in the telling over the years, it captures something essential about what happened that morning off Samar. Johnston had earned the respect of her enemies through sheer, aggressive determination. The lessons of Johnston's battle have been studied and discussed in naval academies and war colleges around the world ever since. The importance of initiative, of attacking when attacked rather than simply defending, of never surrendering the psychological advantage, even when material advantages are completely non-existent, all of these principles were demonstrated in the waters off Samar Island. Evans showed that the true measure of a warship is not found in her specifications or her armament, but in the courage and skill of her crew. Johnston was a fine destroyer, well designed and well built, but she was not exceptional in any technical sense. Dozens of her sister ships served throughout the Pacific without achieving anything like her fame. What made Johnston extraordinary was the spirit of the men who fought her, led by a commander who believed absolutely that there was no situation so desperate that aggressive action could not improve it. The 2 smoke screens and 1 bluff that defined Johnston's battle were fundamentally simple tactics, the kind that are taught in basic naval courses around the world. Smoke screens were a standard defensive measure used by navies since chemical smoke generators were first developed. The concept of bluffing, of making your force appear stronger than it actually was, had been a part of warfare since ancient times. But applying these basic tactics against the most powerful surface fleet in the world, in conditions of overwhelming enemy superiority, required something that could never be taught in any classroom. It required the will to fight regardless of the odds, the courage to attack when attack seemed suicidal, the determination to never give up even when all hope appeared lost. Ernest Evans had that will, his crew had that will, and on October 25, 1944, that will made the difference between catastrophe and survival for thousands of American sailors who owed their lives to a Cherokee warrior from Oklahoma and the ship he loved. The legacy of USS Johnston DD-557 lives on in the United States Navy today. Her name is remembered with honor, and her story is told to new generations of sailors as an example of what courage and determination can accomplish even in the most desperate circumstances. A new destroyer, USS Johnston DDG-102, is planned to carry the name into a new century, continuing the proud tradition established by Evans and his crew, but perhaps the most fitting memorial to Johnston and her crew is the simple fact that the carriers they died protecting survived the battle off Samar. The invasion of the Philippines proceeded on schedule. The war continued toward its conclusion in Japanese defeat. The sacrifice was not in vain. In 2021, a deep sea exploration team finally located the wreckage of Johnston on the floor of the Philippine Sea, lying at a depth of over 21,000 feet. The ship rests broken on the seabed, testimony to the tremendous forces that destroyed her. But she rests in honored glory, a permanent memorial to the courage of her crew. Ernest Evans had promised his men that Johnston would be a fighting ship. He kept that promise until the very end. The 2 smoke screens that concealed the carriers, the bluff that confused the enemy destroyers, the continuous attacks that spread chaos through the Japanese fleet, all of these were the products of a commander who absolutely refused to accept defeat under any circumstances. When the end finally came, Evans was still fighting. He had been wounded multiple times during the battle. He had lost blood that would have incapacitated most men. He had seen his beloved ship torn apart around him, had watched his sailors die at their stations. But he was still giving orders, still directing the battle, still refusing to quit even when quitting was the only rational response to an impossible situation. That is the true legacy of USS Johnston DD-557. That is the real story of two smokescreens, one bluff, and the kind of courage that changes history. That is what happens when ordinary men refuse to accept that a situation is hopeless, when they decide that they will fight with everything they have, when they determine that they will attack until they can attack no more. The waters off Samar Island are peaceful now, giving no obvious hint of the violence that occurred there nearly 8 decades ago. Fishermen ply their trade across the same waves where destroyers charged battleships. Merchant ships pass through without knowing they are sailing over hallowed ground. The ocean keeps its secrets, as it always has and always will. But the spirit of Johnston cannot be found in the wreckage on the ocean floor. It lives on in the sailors who serve today, in the officers who study her battle, in everyone who understands that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. It lives wherever men and women face impossible odds and choose to fight anyway. Ernest Evans and the crew of USS Johnston faced the largest battleship ever built and did not flinch. They laid their smoke screens with shells splashing around them. They executed their bluff with a burning, crippled ship. They fought until they could fight no more, and then they kept fighting a little longer. They saved the carriers they were protecting. They helped turn a battle that should have been a catastrophe into an unlikely victory. They wrote their names into naval history with letters of fire that will never fade. 2 smoke screens, 1 bluff, 1 destroyer against battleships, and a legacy that will never, ever be forgotten.